country, done by our wonderful Uncle Moogie.
What I'd like to do is invite our ancestors here to be with us and stand next to us. Be a part of this gathering. Okay. I said in my language, I asked the ancestors for the directors to come here. What I said in my language, I asked the ancestors from the four directors to come here and sit down in the land of Ghana people, in the land of my mother. My ancestors, your ancestors, wherever you come from, ask them to come here and stand by you, signify their walk, to be a part of your life, but also to look after you as you walk across this country. On behalf of my mother's people, the Ghana people, I welcome you to this land. Thank you for inviting me to do this.
Thank you very much. It was lovely. Thank you. I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Jodie. I'm a co-founder of Adelaide for Assange and project leader for Amnesty International South Australia and Northern Territory. Somewhere around here we have Steph, which is also one of the founders of Adelaide for Assange. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on our traditional country and thank Uncle Moogie again for such a beautiful welcome to country. We have a wonderful lineup of exceptional speakers today, and I would like to thank them for taking time out of their busy schedules to be with us today. We are grateful and honoured. A special mention to Frank Pangallo from SA Best and his team for putting together such a fantastic motion before the South Australian Parliament to be voted on later today. A historic motion that could be the catalyst for the government to negotiate the release of political prisoner and award-winning publisher Julian Assange. The prosecution of Julian Assange for publishing truthful information poses grave threats to press freedom. And the way he has been relentlessly persecuted and silenced is a frontal attack on human rights and freedom itself. Without freedom of speech, there is no democracy. Without democracy, there is no rights. It is not the role of any government to censor, silence, incarcerate, demonise, or isolate any person or publisher that exposes information the government doesn't like. A healthy democracy requires freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom to communicate ideas, to expose truthful information, to dissent, freedom to debate wholeheartedly with how our nation is run and to expose the darkest shadows that have manifested unchecked within our Western democracy. If our collective governments can assume to take these rights away from even a single publisher, one journalist, a citizen, or a whistleblower, where does it stop? When will we say enough is enough? When do we decide to defend all free speech more vigorously and urgently? I, for one, refuse to hand this ever-increasing problem to the younger generation. It must stop now, and we must save Julian Assange. Julian Assange is a revolutionary publisher. His work should be celebrated, discussed, and studied. WikiLeaks has never had to redact a single word, meaning all that he has published was truthful and accurate. If you take away the journalist's ability to report on governmental or corporate wrongdoings, or imprison them for exposing war crimes, you have essentially killed journalism and free speech itself. Today, whilst we stand here in the sunshine, Julian is locked up in a tiny cell in a maximum security prison, deprived of his freedom. Julian is not a criminal. Julian is a victim of criminality.
Yes, free Julian!
For 12 long years, he has suffered in some form of arbitrary detention, a victim of psychological torture. His mental and physical health is in serious decline. With this vote today, we could potentially save his life. This is how dire this situation is. I wish to read an excerpt of Neil Melzer's book, The Trial of Julian Assange. Neil Melzer is the former United Nations Rapporteur on Torture and Other Inhumane Treatment. He states, in 20 years of working with victims of war, violence, and political persecution, I have never seen a group of democratic states ganging up to deliberately isolate, demonise and abuse a single individual for such a long time, and with little regard for human dignity or the rule of law. Niles Melzer's book is amazing, and that is such a powerful statement. I urge you to purchase this book, and if you have the means, to buy a couple of extras or just one extra and gift it to your local MP. I have gifted this book to Simon Birmingham and also Senator Penny Wong. I haven't had a response from either, but you know. I urge you all to get active, to write to your local MPs or to join a group like Adelaide for Assange, Stay Human Project or Amnesty International. We are all part of this democracy. So if we are all part of this democracy, then we all must take responsibility for it. It has to work for all of us. We can't be locking up our publishers, our journalists, or our whistleblowers. Every action counts. Today, I just want to stand here and say, we must free Julian Assange. Thank you. Now, it was with great pleasure to introduce the speakers that we have today. We are starting with Stephen Kenny, who is Julian's lawyer. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Uncle Julian. He's still here. I think he's gone. I acknowledge we're on Kaurna land today and recognise that I've never seen Adelaide or any of that territory. The book, The Trial of Julian Assange, and if you haven't read it, I would suggest you go and get a copy of it. when I first started acting, or when I was first approached to act for Julian, I thought, oh, you know, look, there's a pretty controversial history in the background of this, you know, there's been some pretty nasty things said about him. And I was a bit, to be honest, I was a bit reluctant. I was pretty busy doing a few other things. And then I thought, well, actually, this is not about the individual. This is actually about the principle. And the principle is, do we allow states to hide their criminal behaviour and prosecute those who expose it? And of course, and you'll hear more about that today, I'm sure, from David, who's here with us. But it is. The reason they're prosecuting him is to ensure that no one else becomes a whistleblower. Who wants to be able have to hide in an embassy for years and years and years, and then be locked up in a maximum security prison when he doesn't deserve to be there? And then he's facing a trial in the United States on charges that are clearly pretty shaky of espionage. But it's very clear, I mean, since Julian, there have been very few serious whistleblowers. And we're lucky to have one of them here with us today. Throughout the world, the idea of people becoming whistleblowers is diminishing. So obviously, the states are still hiding their secrets. It was a very long list of war crimes that Julian exposed. And if you doubt it, Google collateral damage and have a close look at the video. I mean, that's what was going on in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places. We're going to see our own criminal behaviour by Australian soldiers exposed very shortly. But that's, you know, that is very clearly what happened. But the other thing is, when I read Niels' book, and I urge you all to go and get a copy of it, that he's looked forensically at what happened in Sweden. I always thought Sweden was a very advanced country. Why wouldn't he go to Sweden and answer the charges there? What's the problem with that? And then I discovered that Sweden's not actually as good as what we think it might be. Sweden is actually quite a dodgy country in my view after having a look at this. And quite frankly, from what I've learned now, and the behaviour of the police in Sweden and the Secret Service, I wouldn't want to go to Sweden either. You know, just to give you an example, just shortly before, while this is all happening, the Swedish secret police took off the street two Egyptian refugees who had refugee status in Sweden, handed them over at the airport to the CIA, who probably flew them to Egypt to be tortured. And we know that because they eventually, one of them reasonably quickly, but the 1 year later, got out and sued the Swedish government. But suing the Swedish government's no good when you're doing 175 years in US maximum security jail. You know, so it was quite reasonable for him to do that. Now, I advised Julian of this gathering today and what's happening here, and on his behalf I'd like to thank you all for coming, because it is you and people like you that are going to secure his freedom. The Australian government and our Prime Minister has effectively given us a promise. You know, he said before the election, enough is enough. We voted for him knowing that he would do something about it. He's now said he doesn't like being a fun diplomacy. Well, that's great, but we want to see some action. And I think it is your pressure on your local politicians that are going to result in that action. And yes, I've been down to see Penny Wong, and yes, I've given her a book, and I gave her a summary of it just in case she was a little busy, so she didn't have to read it all. In fact, we're doing that for most of the politicians because we assume that a lot of them won't read it, so like we give it to the press secretary and go, here, just read this summary at least, and then tell them about it. Sorry, my apologies to the politicians in front of you, obviously already read it. And I have a copy for you, Frank. But do go and see your local federal politician, particularly the Labor ones, and particularly tell them that this is an issue for Australians. We know it is. We've seen the research. We know that the Australian people support Julian Assange. We need him home, and your pressure will do it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Steve. That was amazing.
Right.
Our next speaker speaker today is David McBride, Australian whistleblower. So a huge hand.
Thank you very much. It's no exaggeration for me to say this is one of the proudest days of my life. I was invited here by Frank Pangello, paid for, and for someone who's on trial, to be invited to speak at an official event is really amazing, and it's very humbling. And Stephen stole some of my thunder, even stole my look a little bit, and what he says though is exactly right. And I was the same as him. I didn't completely warm to Julian Assange when I first heard of it. But there are plenty of people in Australia who are the same, and it's them I want to speak to now. It may be quite complicated. Not everybody knows a lot about geopolitics. But the United States position on Julian Assange is simple. It's really not complicated. And it's the same as a man who gets caught out having an affair by their wife, and then he goes and murders his wife on the grounds that she invaded his privacy by looking at his phone. You know, it doesn't get any better than that. That's what they are saying. They can get away with crimes by killing anybody who exposes those crimes. It's not acceptable. It's not the Australian way. Now everybody in the government, the federal government, knows the truth. They're not fools. I mean, Anthony Albanese, as Stephen pointed out, made supportive statements about Julian Assange before the election. And now he's backtracking. Now why is that? Has Julian Assange changed? No. He's obviously had the pressure put on him by the Americans. And they're saying, if you keep up with this, we'll do something in return. Now Albo was elected on the principle that he was someone who believed in only three things: the Labor Party, the Catholic Church, and the Rabbitohs. Now, it appears he believes in doing what the Americans tell him to do. And he needs to grow some, frankly. Australia would like to see a Prime Minister stand up to the Americans and say, and there is no better issue than this. They have been exposed. No matter how much aligned with them we might be on many things, they have been exposed for war crimes, for lies, for double dealing, and they haven't held anybody accountable. You can't kill the messenger before you've taken steps to hold people accountable for the major crimes. We need to call them out on it. We can still be their friends, but we need to call them out. And I think the Australian people want a government with enough backbone who will do that. We're about to have a vote, and apparently my friends in the Parliament have told me that the South Australian Labor Party will vote however Penny Wong tells them to vote. That will be a shame, but again, we'll see. It's not Julian Assange that is on trial, it's the Australian government that is on trial. It's their chance to show what they're really like. Sure, they talk a good game, and Albo is like the kid who makes a speech about how bad bullying is, and he gets a gold star for making a speech about bullying. But then when he sees the bully in the schoolyard, he runs the other way. He turns away, you know. And, you know, we need to, as a nation, show what we think of that kind of behaviour. And There's no, perhaps, few better people who can talk to this than me. I'm about to go to jail. I'm proud to go to jail for standing up for what is right. If our government is simply a lackey of a foreign power, I'm proud to go to jail to try to make things right. This is not the country I grew up in. It's not the country I fought for. It's not the country our grandfathers fought for. Someone has to stand up. It may as well be me. I'm glad to do it. But Julian Assange is a symptom of everything that's wrong in this country. We won't even stand up for him, even though he exposed crimes and the US want to kill him for that. And it goes against all the principles we teach our children. It goes against all the principles of parliamentary democracy. And we're still just going to fold it and send out some ridiculous PR. Oh, we're doing quiet diplomacy. Right, sure they are. Anyway, I'll let someone else speak. But I'm extremely humbled to be here. I'm so grateful. Everyone here is on the right side of history. You will be so proud to be involved in this fight. And let's see how South Australia goes. South Australia led the world, apparently, in getting women to be members of Parliament. It's a fantastic thing that they can be proud of. And I hope today they can be proud of another world first, because once some parliaments start voting for action on Julian Assange, the rest of the world will follow, and you'll be very proud to be at the forefront.
Thank you so much, David. Amazing speech and some really great points to take away there. Just to David's point about once South Australia votes for this motion to be passed, perhaps other states will be inclined to do the same. Well, I got some great news this morning, actually, just before I was leaving home to come here today. I got an email from Dr. Woodruff, who is a member of the Tasmanian Parliament, and they've put a motion in just this week for Julian Assange's release. So, like I said, every little action counts. Even if you think you're just on Facebook, or you're telling a friend, or you're just writing those letters and don't get anything back because we've all been there, just keep doing it. Just keep doing it, and get other people to do it as well. Okay, so now we're very honoured to have Rex Patrick come up and speak with us as well. Thank you, Rex.
Thank you very much. And look, we heard David talk about being special in terms of being prosecuted. He is actually special because he's the only person in relation to the unlawful killings that took place in Afghanistan. He's the only person that's been charged for anything, and that is for whistleblowing. And that's just a terrible situation. That's the sort of special we don't need. Look, it's been 12 years since Julian Assange published the collateral damage video that Stephen talked about, and it's been more than a decade since he was arrested and he has been incarcerated. It's a tragedy for Julian Assange, but it's also a tragedy for freedom of press, and it's a tragedy for our democratic processes. We've got no minister of government standing up for our democratic principles and for things like freedom of press. We can go back to the situation, and it's on both sides of politics, where initially Julia Gillard basically adopted a position that said, well, there are no charges of espionage. There's a matter between the Swedish government and Julian Assange. Even after FOI documents showed that the United States was intending to charge Julian. We then saw both Mr. Abbott, Mr. Turnbull and Mr. Morrison essentially adopt the same position, even though it was known that these charges were going to be brought on. And when they were brought on, the policy adopted by our politicians was one of, let's just conduct quiet diplomacy. Well, sorry, they haven't done anything. I mean, they say they've offered consular assistance, and there is no question that there has been some of that, but there's been no real representation in respect of Julian Assange. I just want to go to some of the facts prior to the current Labor government getting into power. We saw then Shadow Attorney General Mark Dreyfus issue a statement saying Labor wanted the Assange matter, quote, brought to an end. Labor leader Anthony Albanese declared that he couldn't see any purpose to keeping Assange in prison. Enough is enough, he said. He then went on to sign a petition. And yet we find with the change of government there's been no substantive change in the position of the government, of the federal government. What it's essentially gone back to, and one of our senators, Senator Don Farrell, has stood up in the chamber or has made public announcements that this is a matter for the United States and for the United Kingdom in relation to the extradition. Another South Australian Senator, Minister Penny Wong, has simply adopted the approach that this needs to be done very, very quietly. Now it's very interesting. It's been revealed over the last few weeks that when Attorney General used Section 71(1) of the Judiciary Act to drop the proceedings against Bernard Collaery, he did so on the basis of national interest. He did so on the basis that it was affecting international relations. What happened was, and I want you to think about the scale here, we had a very small country, Timor-Leste, who had effectively said in their parliament they want the prosecution of Bernard Collaery to stop. Jose Ramos Horta, who was not the president at the time but is now, deposed in an affidavit in the Collaery proceedings that the prosecution would harm the relationship between the two countries. Friends don't keep secrets from each other. Janana Guzmao has deposed in an affidavit in proceedings that I'm involved in trying to get access to what happened back in the early 2000s. A secret trial that's being run in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. I'm not allowed to see the evidence. I'm not allowed to see the argument of the government for keeping cabinet documents that are 20 years old secret. What happened in the last month or two was that the Australian government visited Timor-Leste, and I am sure, and indeed it's on the record in relation to a question that answered by the government from Jackie Lambie, it's on the record that just prior to announcing that the Collaery charges would be dropped, the Foreign Minister had a conversation with President Jose Ramos Horta. Okay, so we've got a little tiny country exerting influence on a larger country, Australia, and successfully having a prosecution stopped. It beggars belief that we don't have in terms of relative scale, a little country like Australia standing up and saying to the United States, stop this prosecution. All the Australian government has to do is request the US President to pardon Julian Assange. That's the easiest pathway out of this, but the Australian government is not standing up. Everyone needs to understand what this fight is about. This fight has on one side of it censorship and suppression of the freedom of the press. And on the other side it has freedom of the press and liberty. And I certainly know where I stand, on which side I stand. I think our government is somewhat confused. I'll just end up by just maybe giving an example which might make you think. Let's imagine Frank Pangello still working for Channel 7, he's in Singapore, he gets a tip-off that something that China is doing is wrong. Okay, and he reports on it, he blows the whistle on it, he lets people know that China has been doing something nasty to the Uyghurs. And we know that they have, but Frank breaks the news, and then suddenly the Chinese government seek to extradite Frank from Singapore to China. Do you think the Australian government would not stand up in those circumstances? So there's other factors that are playing out here. Australia needs to stand up for democracy, stand up for freedom of the press as well. We need to free Julian Assange.
Thank you very much, Rob. Our next speaker for today is Tammy Franks, the Greens MLC.
Thank you, and I acknowledge I'm here on Ghana land and that sovereignty was never ceded. The Greens proudly will be supporting Frank Pangello's motion, the SA-based motion today. We will vote with our convictions. We will vote for truth and transparency and freedom of the press and for democracy today. The UK's decision to extradite Julian Assange to the US does have frightening consequences for Julian, for press freedom, and for the world, and for our democracy. Julian is not a criminal. As the director of WikiLeaks, he received information from sources and published that information online, and indeed, redacted it where appropriate. He exposed the war crimes of the United States to the world, and to the United States. No matter which way you slice it, these actions amount to journalism. The same thing happens every day in newsrooms right around the world, right here in Adelaide, right across America. If the United States is allowed to pursue charges against Julian Assange, it will have devastating consequences for freedom of speech. It already has had that chilling effect for over a decade now. It sets a dangerous precedent for journalists around the world, and we know that they are increasingly vulnerable to prosecution, but we know Julian is the test case, and for simply reporting the facts, this is not acceptable. Governments should govern as if everyone is watching, and with WikiLeaks, we were able to. Without protection of Julian, without protection of WikiLeaks, we don't have that guarantee. We don't have that good governance. I gotta say, it's pretty disappointing to see the now Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, who I know that apparently, the Rabbitohs, the Labor Party, the Catholic Church, the Three Loves, I always thought he liked to fight Tories as well. And I would have thought fighting Tories and fighting for the truth would have not been too dissimilar. It's been incredibly disappointing to watch the Prime Minister go from an opposition, shadow position of strength, of protection for democracy, to this pathetic excuse for a Prime Minister who wants to put down the megaphone, but certainly doesn't seem to have picked up the phone. Or given he's been over at the funeral, given he's been at these international events, I would have hoped would have been able to have a quiet chat in a corridor by now. Unfortunately, our Prime Minister appears to have fallen silent. He alone has the power to pick up that phone to Washington and tell President Joe Biden, in no uncertain terms, that the US must end this abuse of power and drop the ridiculous charges against Julian Assange. But he refuses to. In fact, the official response from our Australian government is that they have, quote, noted the extradition order and that they would like to see his case, quote, brought to a close. Brought to a close. What, by a suicide, by a death, or by continued silence in the hope that we will all turn away and forget what is happening in our name, in the name of the Australian people, as our government falls silent and becomes complicit in the torture of this man and indeed the suppression of democracy. The deeply troubling conclusion is that their intention to bring it to a close by doing nothing to prevent the extradition of the Australian citizen, by doing nothing to prevent the charging of an Australian citizen, by doing nothing to prevent his prosecution and probable conviction in a US court, will mean that he may be sentenced to up to 175 years in jail for a crime of telling the truth, not for the crimes that were exposed by the truth-telling, the actual war crimes, the killing of innocent civilians, the killing of children in our names, by armed forces, not for what should be rightly seeing people brought before courts. This is not good enough, and we need to tell the Labor Party and the Prime Minister this is not good enough. The community has made it clear that we want the Prime Minister to act quickly, to bring this injustice to an end and to bring Julian home. Julian cannot be left to die because our leaders think it's politically expedient to allow our so-called allies to extract revenge on a journalist who exposed their war crimes. What sort of ally is that? That is not political leadership from Australia, and it is definitely not what the Australian people expect from their Prime Minister. The Australian government must intervene now. No more deferring to so-called due process. This has not been due process. No more noting of developments. The Prime Minister must pick up the phone. The Prime Minister must end this. His Minister, Penny Wong, must end this. And I've got to say, the Labor Party has a state conference coming up in the next few weeks. So if you know a member of the Labor Party, if you know your local MP, if you know someone who's a delegate to that state Labor convention in just 3 or 4 weeks' time, they must be moving motions in favour of letting Julian out, of ending this persecution of Julian and this threat to press freedom. So if you're a Labor Party member, if you know a Labor Party member, make sure that that state convention debates this issue. As WikiLeaks wrote in their statement responding to the extradition news, Julian's freedom is all of our freedoms. The Greens have supported that right through, and I've got to say I commend Rosalie Woodruff in Tasmania, a Greens MP, who is moving a very similar motion to the one we will debate in South Australia today. I know the good work of Senator Peter Whish-Wilson, new Senator David Shoebridge will continue, and I commend former Senator Scott Ludlam for his tireless efforts in support of press freedoms. Without that, we will not bring Julian home. We need to remind the Labor Party of who they are, of how they got elected, and how we all just a few short months ago hoped for change. How we believed their promises that they would bring this to a close, that they would stand up for press freedom, and that we would see them not just fight Tories, but fight for the truth.
Thank you very much, Tammy. That was amazing. Some really fantastic points there, and I'm sure a lot of us will have to get some details on the Labor conference coming up in 3 weeks. Next, I would like to bring to the stage Phil Davies. Phil's from the Stay Human Project, which is a very active group here in South Australia. Thank you, Phil.
Thanks very much, Jo. And I'd like to say thanks to Jo and Adelaide for Assange for organising today's rally. It's great, and with wonderful speakers. Thanks. Every one of the speakers today has spoken from personal experience and great conviction about why it's so important for the health of our society and for the building of a just and humane world that Julian Assange, that man who's been convicted of no crime, a man who has exposed war crimes and the wrongdoings of the powerful, it's so important that he's released from solitary confinement and allowed to live without fear or further persecution. Julian, as you know, is a courageous and ingenious journalist and publisher whose work we should be celebrating. Jodie mentioned Nils Melzer earlier, and I just want to make a few more quotes from him. He's written extensively about Julian, and as a health professional and as a law expert, has a great insight into what's going on. So I'll just give you a few quotes from Nils. He says, the Assange case is the story of a man who is being persecuted and abused for exposing the dirty secrets of the powerful, including war crimes, torture and corruption. It's a story of willful collusion by intelligence services behind the backs of national parliaments and the general public. It's a story of manipulated and manipulative reporting in the mainstream media for the purpose of deliberately isolating, demonising and destroying a particular individual. It's the story of a man who has been scapegoated by all of us for our own social failure to address government corruption and state-sanctioned crimes. It is thus also a story about each and every one of us, our lethargy, our self-deception, and our co-responsibility for the political, economic, and human tragedies of our time. And Mills says, my most important message is that ultimately the trial of Assange is not really about Assange, it's about the integrity of our constitutional institutions. At stake is nothing less than the future of democracy. That certainly backs up what all the previous speakers have said this morning. Mills is spot on. And if we want to protect and uphold the integrity of values of our constitutional institutions, we need the type of transparency and accountability that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks have provided and delivered to the world. Finally, as others have done, I urge you all to contact our political leaders by phone and in writing and ask them to do all in their power to free Julian from his unjust and torturous imprisonment and bring him safely home. To the Albanese government, to Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, to Foreign Minister Penny Wong, to Attorney General Mark Dreyfus, if you value the fair go, if you value justice, if you value freedom of the press, if you value human rights, if you believe that exposing a crime is not a crime, if you really believe, Prime Minister Albanese, that this has gone on for too long, then free Julian Assange! Free Julian Assange! Free Julian Assange! Free Julian Assange!
Thank you so much, Phil. That's an amazing speech and some really fantastic points in there as well. So now we're coming to the end and we are going to have the wonderful Frank Pangallo come up and speak to us. So Frank is the member that has put the motion before the Parliament here today and will be speaking on that later. Thank you very much, Frank.
Thank you very much, Jodie, and thank you for coming here today. It's an important show of support that I'm sure that Julian and others will appreciate, and it's a small group but it's growing all the time, and that's the intent here. I want to welcome also my parliamentary colleague, the Honourable Tammy Franks, for a really stirring speech. Tammy really is passionate. The Greens are passionate about this issue, and I thank you, Tammy, and the support from the Greens. I want to thank Rex Patrick, former Senator and a good friend of mine, for his commentary today. He's spot on about what he says and the inaction of the government. I also want to thank Stephen Kenny as well for being here today, Bill, and also David McBride. David McBride is one of the most courageous people I reckon I've met for what he has done to correct corrupt wrongs. And to do that, he knew what he was facing, the consequences, and he's still doing that today. And we can only wish David all the best in his battle to ensure that Australians in the world, know that what happened in that war was wrong and they need to be brought to account, not make an example of a whistleblower. And this is what the world is doing, the Americans are doing for Julian Assange right now. Now, I come from a journalistic background, and to me, Julian Assange is a hero. He's a hero because he did what few journalists would have the guts to do. And he would have known the consequences himself of releasing such really damaging material. Because what he was doing was exposing corruption of a government, of a democratic government. And for that, he's been persecuted. He's been persecuted by a government that has an act called the Espionage Act.
and it can pursue people around the world, even though they're not even American nationals, and try and bring them to their form of justice. As it's been pointed out here, journalism isn't a crime. In fact, journalists, their prime goal is to actually call out corruption, to call out the wrongs, to show that we live in a democratic society where freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of the press is respected. But the Americans won't do that. Now, imagine if it was one of theirs. Woodward and Bernstein, for instance, with Watergate. Would they have locked them up? Would they have put them in solitary confinement? What would they have done there? Now, we've seen the Americans act like real hypocrites recently when it was revealed about the atrocities, the war crimes that are being committed against Ukrainians by the Russians. And the Americans were the first ones to call out Putin and the Russians for what they were doing. Well, Julian Assange called them out for what they were doing. But there's no defence for Julian Assange, is there? It's disgraceful. It's an absolute disgrace that in our society we would tolerate what is happening to Julian and not work harder to have him released. Now, we've heard about the about face of our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, and the disappointment that we've not heard much from our Foreign Minister, Penny Wong. In opposition, they're all gung ho. But in government, they suddenly become lapdogs for the Americans. They don't wish to upset them. And it's shameful. It's absolutely shameful that the government will not stick up for an Australian who is wrongfully imprisoned. Wrongfully. He shouldn't be there. He should be free. Now today, I have a motion before the Legislative Council that is calling for action, and this is the Parliament of South Australia, are calling for action to have Julian Assange released, free. And we're also calling on the Legislative Council to write to the President of the United States, Joe Biden, and ask him to consider a pardon for Julian Assange. It's the least the Americans could do, especially to an ally like Australia, especially when they want us to welcome them here with their nuclear submarines and other arsenal. I'll let the ambulance go past. Your support is needed, and it's in your hands to spread the message around the country, elsewhere, whatever way you can, just to let the politicians know that action needs to be taken here. I just want to close. I didn't want to do this, but I'm compelled to do it because as a journalist, I'm actually ashamed of my own profession in this country. I'm ashamed that they haven't come out forcibly and supported one of their own in Julian Assange for what he did. Just like the Australians who have exposed corrupt activities in this country would expect support from other journalists, I would have expected that my profession would come out in force and support Julian Assange. So that is another mission for me, is to actually generate some action from within the journalists in this country to support the work that Assange has done, the work that journalists need to be doing, and the work that journalists do every day, because that is their job. Their job is to inform the public of Australia. It's their job to investigate, to expose corruption, to expose wrongdoings, to try and get governments to correct wrongs. And this is what they need to be doing here.
because it is wrong that Julian Assange is being treated the way he is. Now I just want to welcome my colleague here from the upper house, Connie Benares. And Connie is also somebody who's quite passionate about the rights of expression of freedom, the rights of journalists to be able to express themselves. And I'll just get Connie to say a few words before handing back to Jody.
Thank you, everybody. I wasn't expecting to speak today, but there is one thing I will say, and I echo the sentiments that have been expressed by everybody. I thank Tammy and Rob, and especially the Greens, pushing this agenda as hard as they have. The great irony of standing here today is that at 2:15 when we go inside, I can say absolutely pretty much anything I like, and I can do so under the shield of parliamentary privilege, and there are no consequences for me. I do have freedom of speech and freedom of expression inside those chambers, but if one of you were to do the precise same thing out here on the steps of Parliament House, if one of you if one of you were to stand out here,
come on, he's a traitor. He's a traitor.
All right. Gentlemen, move along now. Okay. It's an organised rally, sir. It's an organised rally.
How dare you defend these scum?
Now move along. Move along,
What do you believe is the best country in history that it's been organised?
Move along, mate. You guys don't realise what you don't realise what you're doing. You are a scumbag. Am I there? Don't stand on those terraces. Take my face. Well, I just
Defend the platform against these Remember the Iraq demo in 2003?
Then bring him room and try for treason and see how we go with the protest.
Defend the
Thrown
microphone!
out on the first day.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll just end on that note and say, if one of you were to do precisely the same thing, report those issues to your authorities, report them to the press, then you run the very real risk of facing the same sorts of outcomes as Julian and also of David. That you run the risk of losing the very liberties that this place says that they protect on your behalf. And that is absolutely unacceptable. The only ask I'll have of you today is, I know why you're all here, I know we all support the Free Assange movement, but I ask of you, I plea of you, get behind David and support his cause too. Because it is, it's not just Julian. We've got a person standing right in front of us here who's facing the same sort of persecution today, and Richard, and it's absolutely unacceptable. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you, everybody. And as Brett Patrick has pointed out, Richard Boyle, who blew the whistle on the ATO. And just to finish off, and I've just had a message given to me by one of my staff members that confirms that federal Labor are lapdogs to the Americans. Confirms that state Labor have been nobbled by Senator Don Farrell and Penny Wong. Confirming that they would not support my motion today. So Labor do not support the democratic principles that we all stand for. The freedom of expression and freedom of press, of the press. And it's just a disgrace and shameful that our Premier and his members would actually oppose something like this and that they quiver in fear of their federal colleagues without standing up for themselves. I just hope that my Liberal colleagues don't go wobbly at the knees themselves as well, because that just confirms the stranglehold, the power that the Americans can wield even over our democratic system. Thank you again for coming. Jody, I just want to say a word of thanks to Jody. It was a pleasure meeting Jody a few weeks ago, and she gave me a history of how she became involved in this when she was living in London. And she went to the prison there where Julian Assange is being held. And she decided to become an activist in trying to free Julian just off her own bat. And she's come back to Adelaide and she started the movement here. And she's devoted a lot of time to this and a lot of also effort in recruiting people to the cause. She's done a fantastic job. And I want to thank you, Jody, and I want to thank everyone for coming and all the speakers here today. Again, we want to free Julian Assange. We want to free Julian Assange. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. I also want to thank all the speakers that came today. I think we've had a wonderful array of speakers with a vast amount of knowledge and information. We wish David McBride all the best, and we will definitely be championing his cause strongly and robustly. I know that you have declassified going on in Melbourne. I think that's on the 6th of October. That will be kind of at the start of what's happening in Melbourne. In October we have Julian Assange it's called the Human Chain around Parliament. They're doing it in London. We've got other cities all around the world doing it. We're doing it in Melbourne. So if you can get yourself to Melbourne on the 8th of October, I've got my ticket. We will be there. Adelaide for Assange will be there. I'd like to thank Steph, who's the other part of Julian, Adelaide for Assange. So if you could give her a hand, that would be lovely as well. She does a load of work behind the scenes. So the motion is going to be heard later on this afternoon, I believe. We are allowed to go into the gallery. Come up and speak to me if you need to know any other information in regards to that. But just on a final note, I think I know a lot of faces here, and I know that we are tireless and people are out in the rain, winter time. You know, we're doing all of our different protests. Don't forget, we've got our Tuesday protest. Every Tuesday, we're in front of Penny Wong's office, 4:30 in the afternoon. That's a lovely, we usually go for coffee afterwards. That's a lovely outing for us, just to remind Penny Wong that we are here and we won't be ignored, even though she does love to do that. But yeah, so everyone get involved wherever you can. We must bring Julian home, because it's not just about Julian, it's actually about the freedom of speech, free press, and our democracy itself, and we can't leave it to our children. Free Julian Assange! Free Julian Assange! Free Julian Assange! Free Julian Assange! Thank you very much, everybody. Have a lovely day. Thank you.